Welcome to the Sulky. Bob Hayden, joined by Joe Lee. And this man does a lot more than, well, the rest of us. Joe was in the second race tonight in the amateur race with Karis, winner last week. Joe, let's start right off the bat with Karis before we ask about you and everything else. What about the horse repeating tonight?
Karis, he was good last week. He wasn't 100% last week. He was on the left line a little bit, and so they worked on him this week. And I just warmed him up a little while ago, and he warmed up a lot better than he did last week. So he should be okay in there.
I noticed last week we had a trotting end. There's a Karis right there.
Oh yeah.
And you said last week the weather was a little bit different than tonight.
Oh man, coming for home last week, the wind in our faces was so strong, and. But he was able to endure it, and it took us a while to get to the top. Also, I used him pretty good to get there, but we were able to slow it down going into the third quarter, and he came home just fine, and I think he should be just as good this week.
And last week we had a pacing and a trotting amateur race. Yep. Any preference there for you, pacer or trotter?
No, I just like being in the races. Anybody that gives me an opportunity to drive a horse it's fine for me.
You had a 20-year show jumping career that ended as soon as you got behind the horse?
I did. I jumped horses as a kid and into my early 20s, and I wanted to see coming to the races for so long, and my parents had owned horses when I was a kid. I wanted to see what it was like to sit behind one, and so I hooked up with Buzzy Schulte, and he let me start jogging and training some of his horses in his barn. I used to go down every Saturday and any days that I had off, and as soon as I sat behind one, I gave up the jumping.
Well, Buzzy Schulte is a name we know, but there's also a horse you were telling me about before, where one of the other owners is Schulte, you, and a guy by the name of Joe Torre. Tell us about your New York Yankee involvement.
I've worked in the Yankee clubhouse this will be 24 seasons coming up, and everybody over at Yankee Stadium knows I'm a racing enthusiast, and Joe Torre as well. Joe Torre has owned a lot of great thoroughbreds, and but I told him that I would like to buy some, and so we've gone on partners in a couple, and we just had one here. We've got one coming back to the races in a couple of weeks, Philosophical. She'll be a Muscle Hill filly, and she's coming back next week. She should be qualifying next week or the week after.
So, in other words, you can actually work with Derek Jeter and John Campbell in the same clubhouse in the same day.
Yeah, in the same day.
That's not bad.
That's not something that a lot of people get to do. So
that's pretty cool too.
Yeah.
Now I want to ask you about the fraternity of sorts.
Yeah.
Maybe even sorority, because of obviously that Hannah Miller is a back-to-back amateur driver of the year. But is there a fraternity among the amateur drivers?
I'm learning that as I go. I mean, a lot of the guys have been racing a lot longer than I have. And, a lot of these guys know each other a long time, but they're very, very competitive, and I don't think that anybody loves the sport as much as the amateur drivers. I mean, they support the game from buying the horses, wanting to train them, wanting to drive them, coming to the races. And the amateur drivers, I mean, they log a lot of miles. Like we discussed earlier, I mean, I drove at 13 different tracks last year from Ohio to Canada to New Zealand, and these guys are right there with me. And, any one of these guys, if someone asked them to drive a horse, they would drive to the moon to drive one. So.
And it's a full field, too, 10 horses. That also helped. And
Yeah.
last week, I remember they bet $268,000 on the amateur race. That's a lot of interest.
Yeah, that is a lot of interest. It's nice to see that the crowd supports the handle's there for the amateur racing. Every time that we race here, I mean, I know the handle is pretty good, and it's nice to see. Certainly, our families come out too to watch the races and watch the amateurs, and you bring your friends and they get involved, and that all helps the hand. That all adds up.
Tell me about different horses, because you told me before, if you go to Canada, they're actually going to supply you with the horses?
Yeah, some of the Billings races in the Billings series, they will supply you the horses. The race office is nice enough to, one, let the amateurs race there, and two, organize it and get trainers to put in the horses for you. Whereas like here in this series here at the Meadowlands, we have to find our own horses, or you have to own your own, or find one to drive.
The general manager of the Yankees, Brian Cashman, his father, John Cashman, we renamed the Nat Ray for.
Yep.
Tell us about your dealings with him and his interest in racing.
Brian and I know Brian since I'm 15 from working at Yankee Stadium and in the clubhouse. And he's always been very good to me. And it turns out that my affiliation with Buzzy and Brian were very, very good friends growing up, and they grew up next to each other. So it's all come together and intertwined now. It's all come full circle.
I'll say you had a 10 for 72 year last year. What was your biggest driving thrill so far up to this point? Was there one?
Winning is always fun. Hitting the board is always fun. But I think last year for me, winning a race at Delaware, Ohio, at the site of Little Brown Jug, that was a lot of fun. I mean, it's like the cradle of harness racing. The crowd there is so supportive, and everybody's lined up around the racetrack, and everybody's there just to have a good time. And it's a great experience. If anyone gets to go there, you should really go to Delaware, Ohio. It's a great time.
What happens if there's a conflict in terms of traveling? You know, the Red Sox are in for a 4-game series, but you got to drive somewhere for a race. What happens then?
Well,
what takes precedence is what I'm saying.
the Yankees take precedence. Luckily, there's only 80 home games a year, and I don't go on the road much. So, it's. I mean, if I had 72 drives last year or 70 drives last year, that's a lot. I wish I would have had maybe more, but the Yankees get in the way of that, which is fine.
Yeah. So in other words, you've been a fan for a long time too. You're not just a guy who all of a sudden discovered this. You watch. You followed the sport.
I grew up watching the races. Watching John Campbell and those guys drive, and Mike LaChance. And when I was 15, I was fortunate enough, John was driving some of George Steinbrenner's horses, and he was right outside the dugout one day, and I knew who he was. Not everybody in the dugout knew John Campbell, but I knew who he was. And John and I got to know each other. He signed an autographed picture for me, and then later that year I sent an autographed baseball to John, and we've been friends ever since. So I've been watching the racing since I'm a little kid.
That might have been 1998, because I know John threw out the first ball, I think the day before the Hambletonium, that Muscles Yankee
somewhere
won.
Around that time, yeah. It was in the mid-'90s for sure.
Yeah, and we put on your bio here, amateur harness racing historian. How do you feel about that?
That works for me. That works for me.
I was talking before about all the things that you do. I said, you're going to challenge Peter Kleinhans, where no one's close to him, as the most well-rounded, talented, does-everything person in the sport. And you said you and Peter were involved.
Yeah, Pete and I went to New Zealand this year. We got invited to go. Pete won a trip to New Zealand, and I got to go tag along and drive some horses there. Pete just put together an album, and we were talking about it in New Zealand, and I told him that I play the piano, so we've been trying to get together to maybe set up a jam session and do that, so that'll be fun.
I tell you what, I feel so insufficient around you guys, but good work. Joe Lee, good luck tonight in the second race, all the amateur races. Jen Bongiorno comes on, will join me shortly right after this.
Great, thanks.